In the quiet stillness of this night, let this Bible story gently unfold so you can rest slowly. In a land far away, beneath a sky filled with quiet and steady stars, there stood a great and powerful kingdom, a place surrounded by towering walls and wide gates, watched over by silent guards who moved without urgency, as if even their presence understood the calm of the night. And within this kingdom, everything seemed to slow. The air itself gentle and still, carrying no pressure, no demand, no need to rush. As darkness settled softly over the land, and the world rested in a quiet and steady rhythm. This was a place of strength and order, a kingdom built with purpose and authority, where everything stood firm and unshaken. And within the heart of it all, there lived a king whose name would be remembered across lands and through generations. A ruler whose presence carried power, whose word shaped the movement of nations, and whose reach extended far beyond what the eye could see. And his name was Nebuchadnezzar II, a king surrounded by all that he had built, standing at the center of a vast and powerful empire. He ruled over lands that stretched endlessly, with nations beneath his command, and voices that answered when he spoke. And yet, as the night settled around him and the noise of the day faded into silence, there was a truth that remained untouched by his power, something that did not rise or fall with kingdoms or rulers, something steady and unchanging above it all, that God was greater than everything. Greater than the strength of walls, greater than the command of kings, greater than anything that could be seen or held. The city itself rested in silence, its streets no longer filled with movement, its walls holding the quiet within them, as soft winds passed gently through open spaces, brushing along stone and drifting through courtyards without resistance, while torches flickered faintly, their light moving slowly across the ground. And above it all, the sky stretched endlessly, filled with stars that remained steady and unmoving, just as they had always been, constant and calm, untouched by anything below. Within the palace, the night carried the same quiet presence. Long halls standing still beneath shadows that stretched along the walls, pillars rising high into darkness, and the air untouched by noise or urgency, as if everything within those walls had agreed to rest. And in those quiet moments, even a king would find himself alone, not with his people, not with his power, but with his own thoughts, in a silence that did not ask anything of him, but simply remained. For all his authority and all that he controlled, there were things beyond him, things unseen, and unknown, things that could not be commanded or shaped by his will. And in that stillness, something began to form within him. Not loud, not overwhelming, but quiet and steady. A thought that would not fade, a question that had no immediate answer. Something deeper than power, something that could not be pushed aside. And yet, above every thought and above every question, one truth remained unchanged. That God was greater than everything, greater than every concern, greater than every unknown, greater than every thought that could rise within him. The night continued slowly, as if time itself had softened, the kingdom breathing in a calm and steady rhythm, untouched by urgency, untouched by pressure. As everything remained in place without effort, and as the king rested within his palace, surrounded by all that he had built, he could feel it more clearly. Not in the movement of the day, but here in the quiet, that even in the center of power, there were things he could not hold, things he could not control, and that above it all, beyond it all, God remained greater than everything. Far beyond the palace walls and guarded gates, the land stretched into open and quiet fields, where the wind moved softly through space untouched by structure, where the world felt still, calm, and unshaken. And in that stillness, there was a reminder that did not need to be spoken loudly, a reminder that settled gently and remained, that no matter how great a kingdom may become, no matter how strong a ruler may be, there is always something greater, something unshaken, something eternal. And as the night deepened and the silence settled even further, something unseen, something unknown was slowly drawing near. Not with force, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty, moving in its own time, as the story continued to unfold, and the quiet settled more fully into every street and every hall. The stillness began to press gently against the edges of the king's thoughts, not with force, but with a quiet persistence that could not be ignored. And within the palace, where everything had long stood under his command, there came a moment where even Nebuchadnezzar II could not direct what was forming within him. As if the silence itself had begun to reveal something that power could not reach. He remained within his chamber, surrounded by walls that had never failed him, by a kingdom that had always answered to his voice. And yet, as his eyes closed and the weight of the night settled over him, something began to take shape beyond his control. Not in the world outside, but within the quiet space of his mind, where images formed slowly, softly, without warning and without command, as a dream began to rise. It did not come with noise or sudden movement, but with a steady and unbroken presence, as though it had always been there, waiting for the moment when everything else had become still. And in that dream, he saw something vast, something greater than anything he had built. Something that stood before him in silence, yet carried a weight that could not be measured. A presence that did not speak, but was understood without words. There was a figure, tall and unmoving, formed with a kind of perfection that seemed beyond the work of human hands. Its presence calm, yet overwhelming, not in fear, but in its certainty. As if it stood outside of time, untouched by the rise and fall of kingdoms, and though he was a king who had seen many things, who had commanded armies and shaped nations, this was something different, something he could not name, something he could not place within his understanding. And as the dream continued, there was a quiet shift, not sudden, not violent, but certain, as though something unseen had moved. And what once stood strong began to change, not with chaos, but with purpose, as if it followed a design far beyond his own. A design that did not ask for his approval and did not depend on his command. A design that simply was steady and unchanging in its course. Even within the dream, there was a sense that what he was seeing was not meant to be controlled, not meant to be altered, but simply understood. And yet, that understanding did not come easily, as the images remained clear, but their meaning stayed just beyond his reach. Like something close enough to feel, but not close enough to hold. And in that space between knowing and not knowing, a quiet unease began to form. It was not fear, not in the way the world might understand it, but a deeper awareness, a recognition that there were things beyond his power, beyond his reach, beyond his authority, things that did not respond to his voice, things that existed above him and through it all. The dream carried a steady truth, unspoken yet present, that God was greater than everything, greater than what he had seen, greater than what he could understand, greater than anything that stood before him. And as the dream began to fade, slowly and without urgency, the images softening into the quiet of the night, once again, he found himself returning to stillness, yet not the same stillness as before. For something had shifted, something had been placed within him that would not easily leave, a question without answer, a meaning not yet revealed, something that would remain, even as the night continued in calm and quiet rhythm. The palace was, as it had been, silent and unmoving. The city still resting beneath the stars, the wind still passing gently through its streets. And yet within the king, there was now something more, something that had not been there before, something that would wait patiently until it was brought into the light, until it was spoken, until it was understood. And though all around him remained calm, and though his kingdom stood unchanged, the quiet truth remained above it all, steady and unshaken, that God was greater than everything, greater than the dream, greater than the king, greater than all that was seen and unseen. As the quiet of the night gave way to the first soft hints of morning, the king awoke within his chamber. The stillness of the palace unchanged, the walls as strong as they had always been. The kingdom as vast as it had ever been, and yet within him something remained unsettled. Not loudly, not with urgency, but with a quiet persistence that stayed beneath the surface. As though the dream had not fully left him, but lingered just beyond his reach. He rose slowly, surrounded by the same power, the same authority, the same presence that had always defined him. And yet the clarity he once held did not feel as firm as before, for what he had seen in the night could not be shaped by command, and could not be dismissed by will. And though the world around him moved as it always had, there was now something within him that did not follow that same order. The halls of the palace filled once again with quiet movement, servants passing through with care, voices low and controlled, as the rhythm of the kingdom returned. Yet the king carried with him the weight of something unseen, something that could not be placed among the tasks of the day, something that did not belong to the visible world, and yet could not be ignored. He called for those who were known for wisdom, those who had stood before him in times past, those who were trusted to bring understanding where there was uncertainty, and they gathered before him. Standing within the great hall, waiting in the quiet that always surrounded his presence, yet even as they stood there, the stillness held something different now, something unspoken that rested beneath the surface. The king spoke of what he had seen, of the image that stood before him, of the quiet certainty within the dream, and of the meaning that remained hidden from him. And though his words were steady, there was a depth within them that revealed what he did not say directly. That this was not something he could set aside, not something that would fade with time, but something that required understanding. Those who stood before him listened carefully, each holding their place, each aware of the weight of the moment. Yet when they were asked to reveal the meaning, the silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but the silence of limitation. For what had been shown to the king did not come from human understanding, and could not be explained by knowledge alone. One by one, their responses fell short. Their words unable to reach what had been seen, and though they spoke with care, their answers carried no certainty, no clarity that could settle what remained within him. And in that moment, it became clear that what troubled the king was not something that could be resolved through power or position, but something that stood beyond it. And yet, within that same kingdom, there was one who did not rely on his own understanding, one who had learned to listen beyond what could be seen, one whose calm did not come from status, but from something deeper, something steady and unshaken. And his name was Daniel. He was brought before the king, not with urgency, but with a quiet purpose, And as he stood within the presence of power, he did not carry the same uncertainty as the others, for he did not depend on himself to provide what was needed. And in that stillness, there was a different kind of confidence, one that did not rise from knowledge, but from trust. The room remained quiet as he listened, as the king spoke once more of the dream, of the image of what had been seen and not understood. And though the moment held weight, there was no rush, no pressure in his response. For what was to be revealed would not come from effort, but from something already known beyond human reach. And in that calm presence, as the silence settled once again over the room, there remained a truth that had not changed, that God was greater than everything. Greater than the king, greater than the dream, greater than the understanding of men, and that what was hidden would be revealed. Not by power, but by what had already been placed beyond it. The day continued, the kingdom remained, and yet the moment had shifted, gently and without force. And as the quiet of the moment settled over the great hall, all eyes remained upon Daniel, whose calm presence stood in contrast to the uncertainty that had filled the room before him. And though he stood before a king whose power stretched across nations, there was no strain in his posture, no urgency in his breath, only a steady stillness, as though he was not standing alone, but supported by something unseen, something greater than the moment itself. He did not rush to speak, nor did he rely on his own strength to answer what had been asked, but instead he allowed the silence to remain for a moment longer, as if giving space for what was to come. And when he finally spoke, his words carried no pride, no claim of personal wisdom, but a quiet acknowledgement that what the king sought could not be found within man, but only through God, who reveals what is hidden and makes known what cannot be understood by human thought alone. The room remained still as his voice moved calmly through the space, not loud, not forceful, but clear and steady. And as he spoke, there was a sense that something deeper was being uncovered. Not just the meaning of a dream, but the truth that stood behind it, a truth that had always been present, waiting to be seen, waiting to be understood in its own time. He began to describe what the king had seen, not guessing, not searching, but speaking with certainty. As though the images of the night had been placed before him as clearly as they had been before the king. And with each word, the quiet tension within the room softened, not because the meaning was simple, but because it was becoming clear that what had been hidden was now being revealed. The great image, vast and unmoving, was not without purpose, nor was it without order, for each part carried its place, each section holding meaning beyond what could be seen at first glance. And as he spoke, it became known that the dream was not only about what stood before the king, but about what would come after. About kingdoms that would rise and fall, about time moving forward in a way that no man could control. No matter how powerful he might be. And yet, even as these things were spoken, there was no urgency in the telling, no pressure in the unfolding of what was to come. For the message was not one of fear, but of truth, a steady reminder that all things move according to a greater order, one that does not depend on kings or kingdoms, but on something far beyond them. He spoke of how what seemed strong would not remain forever, how what appeared unshaken would one day give way, not through chaos, but through a design already set in place, a design that did not require the hand of man to complete it. And within that understanding, there was a quiet clarity that power, no matter how great, is never the final authority. And then, as his words continued, he spoke of something greater still, something that would not fall, something that would not be replaced, something that would stand beyond all that had come before it. A kingdom not built by human hands, not shaped by human will, but established by God, unshaken and eternal, beyond time, beyond power, beyond all that could rise and fall. As these words settled into the silence of the hall, there was no need for loud reaction, no sudden movement, only a quiet awareness that what had been spoken carried a truth that reached beyond the moment, beyond the king, beyond the room itself, and in that stillness, it became clear that what had been revealed was not just the meaning of a dream, but a reminder of what had always been true. God is greater than everything, greater than every kingdom, greater than every ruler, greater than all that is seen and unseen. And though the king stood in the fullness of his power, surrounded by all that he had built, he now stood in the presence of something that could not be commanded, something that could not be shaped by his will, something that simply was steady and unchanging. And in that quiet realization, there was a shift. Not loud, not sudden, but certain, as understanding began to take its place. The hall remained calm, the kingdom unchanged, and yet the moment had moved forward. Gently and without force, as the truth continued to unfold in its own time, just as it had from the beginning, and as it would continue, steady and unshaken, beyond all things. And as the words settled into the stillness of the hall, the king remained quiet for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but as if allowing what had been spoken to rest within him, to take its place without resistance. And though he had heard many voices in his life, many words spoken in his presence, this was different, not because of its volume, but because of its weight, a weight that did not press down, but instead settled gently, steady, and undeniable. Before him stood Daniel, calm and unmoved, not seeking recognition, not drawing attention to himself, but simply standing in the quiet confidence of what had been revealed. And in that moment, the difference between power and truth became clear, not in conflict, but in contrast, as one stood on what could be built and commanded, and the other on what could only be received. The king, who had seen nations rise beneath his authority, and had watched the reach of his command stretch across distant lands, now stood in a place where command was not needed, where control did not apply, and where understanding had come not through force, but through something greater than himself, something that did not depend on his strength and did not change with his will. And though his kingdom remained vast, and though his position had not changed, there was now a quiet awareness within him, a recognition that what he held was not final, that what he ruled was not eternal, and that beyond all that he could see, beyond all that he could build, there was something greater, something that would remain when all else had passed. There was no rush in his response, no need to speak quickly, as though even he understood that this moment did not require movement. But stillness, and in that stillness, the truth that had been revealed did not fade, but remained steady and present, shaping the space without effort. And as the day carried on, and the movement of the kingdom returned in its quiet rhythm, the memory of what had been spoken did not leave him, but stayed not as a burden, but as a presence, something that would return in moments of silence. Something that would remain when all else had grown quiet. For though he was a king, and though his name would continue to be known, there was now within him an understanding that went beyond his throne, beyond his authority, an understanding that there are things that cannot be held, cannot be controlled, and cannot be made to follow the will of man. Things that exist beyond power, beyond reach, beyond even the greatest of kingdoms. And in that understanding, there was no need for resistance, no need to grasp tightly, for what had been revealed was not meant to be fought, but accepted, not meant to be shaped, but understood in its own time, in its own way, as part of something far greater than any one life, any one ruler, any one moment. The kingdom stood as it always had. The palace walls remained strong, the gates still guarded, the city still resting beneath the wide and endless sky. And yet within the king, something had shifted, quietly and without force. As the truth continued to take root, not loudly, not suddenly, but gently, just as the night had first carried it to him. And above it all, beyond all that had been seen and spoken, there remained one steady truth, unchanged and unshaken, that God was greater than everything. Greater than every throne, greater than every kingdom, greater than all that rises and all that fades, And as time moved forward in its quiet and steady way, the memory of what had been revealed did not fade from the king's thoughts, but remained, returning to him in moments of stillness, in the spaces between decisions, in the quiet pauses where nothing needed to be spoken. And though the kingdom continued in its strength, and though his authority remained unchanged before men, there was now within him a deeper awareness, one that did not come from what he had built, but from what he had been shown. The days passed as they always had, with order and structure guiding the movement of the kingdom. And yet, beneath that steady rhythm, something continued to grow, not visibly, not outwardly, but within the quiet place where thoughts settle and understanding begins to take shape. And though he did not speak of it often, the truth remained, steady and present, that what he held was not beyond change, and what he ruled was not beyond time. And yet, as often happens when power is held for long, the weight of authority can slowly return to the surface. Not all at once, but in quiet ways, in small thoughts, in moments where strength begins to feel like certainty again. Where what is seen begins to feel permanent, and what is built begins to feel unshaken. And though the truth had been revealed, the heart of man does not always hold it firmly without drifting. There came a day, calm and clear, when the king stood upon the heights of his palace, looking out over the city that stretched before him, its walls strong, its gates secure, its people moving in the quiet rhythm of a kingdom at peace. And as he looked upon all that had been established under his rule, there was a moment where his thoughts rose, not in fear, not in uncertainty, but in quiet admiration of what stood before him. He saw the greatness of the kingdom, the work of his hands, the strength of what had been built, and for a moment, the stillness of the truth that had once settled within him grew faint, not gone, but distant. As another thought took its place, a thought that looked upon the visible and began to measure worth by what could be seen, by what could be claimed, by what could be held. And in that quiet moment, as he stood above it all, the balance between what had been revealed and what was felt began to shift. Gently but surely, as if the heart itself was being tested, not with force, but with presence. With the simple question of where understanding would rest, whether in what was built or in what had been shown beyond it. The sky above remained unchanged, wide and steady. The same quiet stars that had watched over the night, now hidden behind the light of day, yet still present, still constant, just as truth remains even when it is not seen. And though the world below moved as it always had, something deeper was unfolding, something that would not be stopped, something that would not be delayed. And in that unfolding, there was no urgency, no sudden movement, only the quiet certainty that what had been revealed would not be forgotten, that what had been shown would come again, not to bring fear, but to bring clarity, to remind, to restore. to return the heart to what is steady and true. For above every moment, above every thought, above every rise and every fall, there remained the same unshaken truth that God was greater than everything, greater than what is seen, greater than what is built, greater than what is held, and that in time all things would return to that understanding. And as the day slowly gave way to evening once again, the light softened over the great city, and the long shadows of the palace stretched quietly across the stone, as though the world itself was returning to the same stillness from which it had come, and the movement of the kingdom began to slow. Voices fading, footsteps growing lighter, until the calm of the night settled once more over everything that had been built and held. The king returned to his chamber, the same place of quiet and distance from the world, where the noise of the day could no longer reach him. And though the walls remained strong and unchanged, there was within him a space that did not feel as firm as before. Not broken, not disturbed, but open in a way that could not be ignored. As if something within him was being gently drawn beyond what he had always known. And in that stillness, without command, without effort, the night once again carried something with it. Something that did not arrive with sound or warning, but with a quiet certainty, as the boundary between waking and rest softened, and his thoughts began to drift into that same place where understanding had once been shown to him, not by his will, but by something greater. The dream returned, not as it had before, but with a different weight, a different presence, as though it was no longer something to be seen from a distance, but something to be felt more deeply, something that moved not only before him, but within him, revealing not just what would come, but what already was. There was a vast tree rising from the earth with strength and fullness, its height reaching toward the sky, its branches spreading wide, offering shelter and rest, its leaves full and steady, untouched by weakness, and beneath it, all things seemed to gather. As though it stood at the center of life itself, strong, visible, and unshaken, the tree remained, calm and unmoving, as the world existed beneath it, as though it was enough on its own, as though nothing could take its place, nothing could bring it down. And yet, within the quiet of the dream, there came a voice, not loud, not harsh, but certain. A voice that carried authority not from force, but from truth. A voice that did not need to rise to be heard. And with that voice, there came a change, not rushed, not chaotic, but clear and steady. As the tree that once stood in fullness was no longer left untouched, as though what seemed permanent was now being revealed as something that could not remain as it was. Something that would be brought low, not out of destruction, but out of purpose. The branches that once spread wide were no longer held in place. The height that once reached the sky was no longer sustained, and though it did not happen in violence, it happened with certainty, as if the design had already been set, as if what was unfolding had always been known beyond the moment itself. And yet, even in this change, not everything was taken, not everything was removed, for something remained, something left within the ground, held in place, bound but not destroyed, as though what was being done was not an ending, but a process, not a loss without return, but a transformation that would come in its own time. The dream carried this understanding without needing explanation, revealing that what rises can be lowered, and what is lowered can be restored, but not by its own strength, not by its own will, but by something greater, something beyond what is seen, something beyond what is held. And within it all, there remained that same quiet truth, steady and unchanging, that God was greater than everything, greater than what stands tall, greater than what is brought low, greater than every rise and every fall, and that nothing exists outside of that greater order. As the dream slowly began to fade, returning once more into the quiet stillness of the night, the image of the tree remained within him, not just as something seen, but as something felt, something that would not be forgotten, something that would wait quietly until it was understood. And the night carried on, gently and without interruption, the palace still, the city resting, and the king lying within the silence once more. And when the night had passed, and the first quiet light of morning returned to the city, the king rose once more within his chamber. The same walls around him, the same kingdom beyond him, and yet within him, the presence of what had been seen remained. Not as a distant memory, but as something near, something that did not fade with the passing of time, something that waited to be understood. The image of the tree lingered within his thoughts. Its height, its strength, its quiet fall, and the voice that had spoken with certainty. And though the world around him moved as it always had, the meaning behind what he had seen did not reveal itself easily. As if it was not meant to be grasped quickly, but slowly in its own time. He walked once again through the halls of his palace, where the rhythm of the kingdom continued, where voices returned, where movement resumed. And yet beneath all of it, there was a stillness within him that did not belong to the world around him. A stillness that carried the weight of something unseen, something that could not be shaped by command or dismissed by thought. And so, as he had done before, he called for those who were known for understanding, those who stood ready to interpret what could not be seen clearly. And they came before him once more, standing in the same great hall, beneath the same high pillars, within the same quiet presence that surrounded his authority. He spoke to them of the dream, of the great tree, of its strength and its fall, of the voice that had spoken with certainty, and he asked again for understanding. Not in anger, not in haste, but with a quiet insistence, as though something within him already knew that this could not be left unanswered. And yet, as before, the silence that followed revealed the same truth, that what had been shown to him did not belong to human understanding alone, and that no matter how much knowledge was gathered, it could not reach what had been revealed in the quiet of the night. And so once again, there was one whose presence did not shift with uncertainty, one who did not depend on his own strength to respond, one who stood calmly where others could not. And he was brought forward once more, Daniel, whose understanding did not come from within himself, but from something greater. He listened carefully as the king spoke, as the details of the dream were shared, as the image of the tree and its fall were placed before him. And though the meaning was not simple, there was no confusion in his stillness, no hesitation in his presence, as though what needed to be revealed was already known, waiting only to be spoken. For a moment, he remained quiet, not from doubt, but from reverence for what was to be said, for he understood that the meaning carried weight, not only for the king, but for what was to come. And in that quiet pause, the room itself seemed to wait, as though even the air had grown still in anticipation. And when he began to speak, his voice was calm, steady, without force, as he revealed that the tree the king had seen was not something distant, not something separate, but something close, something known, something that represented the king himself. His strength, his reach, his place within the world. And as these words were spoken, the meaning began to take shape. He spoke of how the greatness of the tree reflected the greatness of the king, how its height and strength mirrored the power he held, how its presence reached far and wide, just as his kingdom had extended across many lands, and in that reflection there was no denial of what had been built, no rejection of what had been established. But then, as the meaning deepened, he spoke of what would come, not as a threat, not as a punishment spoken in anger, but as something certain, something that would unfold according to a greater order. That the king would be brought low, not destroyed, but humbled, separated from what he had always known, removed from the place of control, until he would come to understand what had been shown to him from the beginning. And though the words carried weight, they were not spoken with fear, but with clarity, as a truth that could not be changed. That the king would come to know that the Most High rules over all, that no power stands above him, that no kingdom exists outside his authority, and that what is given can also be taken, and what is taken can also be restored. The room remained still as these words settled into the silence. And though nothing around them had changed, something within the moment had shifted once more. And as the words of Daniel settled gently into the quiet of the hall, there was no sudden movement, no raised voices, only a deep and steady stillness, as though the moment itself had paused, allowing the meaning to take its place without resistance. And though the king stood in the fullness of his power, surrounded by all that he had built, there was now before him a truth that did not bend to his will. A truth that did not change with his authority. For a time, nothing was spoken, as if even the walls of the palace held the silence. And within that silence, the weight of what had been revealed rested calmly, not pressing, not overwhelming, but certain. And in that certainty, there was no need for argument. No need for denial. Only the quiet presence of what would come in its own time. The king returned once more to the rhythm of his days, to the movement of the kingdom, to the order that had always surrounded him. And yet the words remained, not distant, not forgotten, but present, waiting quietly beneath the surface, as though they would rise again when the moment was right. Time passed gently, without urgency, the kingdom continuing in its strength, the city standing firm, the people moving in calm and steady rhythm, and the palace remaining unchanged. Its halls still and its walls strong, as though nothing had shifted at all. And yet, within the unseen, something had already begun to unfold. There came a day, calm and unremarkable in its beginning, when the king walked once more upon the heights of his palace, looking out over the great city that stretched before him. Its towers rising, its gates standing open, its life moving in quiet order beneath him. And as he looked upon all that had been built, there came a moment where his thoughts rose once again toward what he could see, toward what he could claim, toward what stood as a reflection of his own strength. He saw the beauty of the kingdom, the work of his hands, the greatness that surrounded him, and for a moment, the quiet truth that had once been placed within him faded into the background. Not gone, but distant, as another voice began to form within him, a voice that looked upon the visible and found certainty in it, a voice that measured worth by what stood before him. And in that moment, as he stood above it all, there was no storm, no sudden change, only a quiet turning, as though something unseen had taken its place, as though the balance had shifted gently, and the understanding that had once been clear now rested beneath the surface. Waiting once again to be brought forward. The sky above remained wide and steady, unchanged by what was taking place below. the same quiet presence that had always been there. And yet, within the moment, something had already begun, something that would not be stopped, something that would not be delayed, something that would move according to a greater order beyond what could be seen or controlled. And though the kingdom stood strong, and though the king remained in his place, there was already a movement unfolding, quiet and certain. As the truth that had been spoken began to take form, not with force, not with noise, but with the same calm presence that had carried it from the beginning. For above every moment, above every thought, above every rise and every fall, there remained the same unshaken truth, steady and unchanged, that God was greater than everything, greater than every throne, greater than every kingdom, greater than all that is built and all that is held. And as the quiet moment stretched across the height of the palace, and the king stood looking over all that had been built, the stillness of the air remained unchanged. Yet something unseen had already begun to move, not in the world around him, but within the space where strength and certainty had once stood without question. And though nothing had yet shifted in what could be seen, there was already a change unfolding beneath the surface. The words that had once been spoken had not been lost, though they had grown distant, resting quietly beneath the weight of what stood before him. And in that distance, there came a moment where the balance tipped, not suddenly, not with force, but gently, as though something deeper had taken hold, something that could not be resisted, something that did not wait for permission. And in that moment, as the king remained where he stood, surrounded by the fullness of his power, the change came, not with noise, not with warning, but with certainty. As though the truth that had been revealed had now begun to take its place, not outside of him, but within him, moving in a way that could not be directed or undone. The strength that had once felt unshaken no longer held in the same way, not because it had been removed, but because something greater had stepped beyond it. Something that did not depend on what had been built, something that did not follow the order of men. And in that shift, the control he once held began to loosen. Not all at once, but in a way that could not be stopped. The world around him remained, the kingdom still standing, the palace unchanged, and yet within him there was now a separation from all that had once defined him, as though the place he had stood in had been gently moved away, leaving him in a space where what he had known no longer guided him in the same way. He was led away from what was familiar, not in chaos, not in struggle, but in a quiet and certain unfolding. As though what was happening had already been set in place long before the moment had arrived, and though it could not be understood in the way the world understands, it carried a purpose that did not need to be explained to be fulfilled. Time moved differently in that place, not marked by command or decision, but by something slower, something deeper, as though each moment was being shaped without effort. And though the strength of the king had once defined his life, it no longer held the same meaning. For what remained now was not power, but presence, not control, but being. The land around him stretched open and quiet, untouched by walls, untouched by structure. And within that space, there was no need to build, no need to command, no need to hold tightly to anything, as though everything that had once been necessary had fallen away, leaving only what could not be taken, what could not be changed. And in that stillness, without noise, without distraction, there came a slow and steady awareness. Not forced, not rushed, but unfolding gently, that what had once been held as everything was not everything at all, and that beyond it, above it, and through it, there had always been something greater, something that had never shifted, never changed, never been moved. And though the days continued, and though the moments passed without urgency, the truth remained, quiet and unshaken, that God was greater than everything. And as time continued in that quiet and unmeasured way, the world around him remained still and unchanged. The open land stretching without boundary, the air moving gently without resistance. And within that stillness, something deeper began to take shape, not in a single moment, but slowly, as though each passing day carried a quiet understanding that did not need to be forced. The strength that had once defined him was no longer something he could reach for, no longer something that guided his thoughts or his place in the world. And yet, in the absence of what had once been certain, there was now space. Space for something that had always been present, but had not been seen clearly before. Something that did not depend on power and did not change with position. There were no walls to hold, no voices to command, no kingdom to direct. And in that absence, there was no need to strive, no need to measure, no need to hold tightly to anything, as though everything that had once been necessary had been gently set aside, leaving only what could remain without effort, without control, without demand. And in that quiet place, where nothing was required and nothing was expected, there came a steady awareness. Not sudden, not overwhelming, but clear, that what he had once believed to be his strength had never truly been his own, and that what he had once held as permanent had never been beyond change. The sky above remained constant, wide, and steady, the same presence that had always been there, unchanged by the rise of kingdoms and the fall of power. And in looking upon it, there came a quiet recognition that what is truly unshaken does not depend on what is built below, but exists beyond it, beyond time, beyond control. And slowly, without urgency, without force, understanding began to return, not as it had been before, but deeper, steadier, as though it had been refined through stillness, shaped not by knowledge alone, but by what had been experienced, by what had been revealed in the quiet spaces where nothing else remained. There came a moment, calm and certain, when the weight that had once been carried began to lift, not suddenly, but gently, as though it had never needed to be held in the first place. And in that release there was clarity, not of power, but of truth. A truth that did not rise and fall, but remained steady through all things. And in that moment, the understanding became clear that the Most High rules over all, that no kingdom stands above him, that no power exists outside of his will, and that all things, no matter how great they may appear, rest within something far greater, something unshaken, something eternal. And as this truth settled fully within him, there was no resistance, no struggle, only a quiet acceptance, as though everything had returned to its rightful place, as though what had been unclear had now been made steady and sure, not by effort, but by what had always been true. And the story continued, gently and without haste, as what had been taken was now ready to be restored, not in the same way as before, but in a way that carried understanding, in a way that held truth, in a way that remained grounded in what is greater than everything. And as that quiet understanding settled fully within him, there came a gentle return, not sudden, not forceful, but steady and certain, as though what had been set aside was now being placed back in its rightful order. And the world that had once felt distant began to draw near again, not in the same way as before, but with a deeper stillness, a deeper clarity that remained beneath everything he now saw. The strength of his mind returned to him, not as it had once been, driven by power and command, but with a calm awareness, a clarity shaped by what he had come to understand. And as he lifted his eyes once more, the world appeared the same, yet not the same, for what he now saw was no longer measured only by what stood before him, but by what stood above it all. He was brought back from the open land, back toward the place where walls stood and gates were held, back to the kingdom that had once defined him, and though everything remained as it had been, the meaning of it had changed, for it no longer stood as the center of all things, but as something held within something greater. The palace received him once again, its halls still strong, its pillars still rising into shadow. Yet now there was no need within him to hold tightly to what surrounded him. No need to measure his place by what he controlled, for what had been revealed had already taken its place within him, steady and unshaken. Those who saw him recognized the return of the king, the restoration of what had once been, and yet there was something different, something not easily seen, something that did not need to be spoken, as though the presence he carried now was not only that of a ruler, but of one who had come to understand what stands above all rulers. And in that quiet return, there was no pride, no need to declare greatness, only a calm acknowledgement of what had been shown, a recognition that what he held was given, and what had been taken for a purpose, not to destroy, but to reveal, not to remove, but to restore with understanding. The kingdom continued, the the people moved as they always had. The walls remained strong, and the city stood beneath the same wide sky. And yet, within it all, there was now a deeper stillness, a deeper truth that did not depend on what was built, but on what had been revealed beyond it. And in that stillness, the king spoke, not to claim what was his, but to acknowledge what was greater, lifting his voice not in pride, but in quiet understanding, recognizing that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men, that all power rests within his hand, and that what is given according to his will. There was no struggle in this recognition, no resistance, only peace. A peace that did not come from holding power, but from releasing it into what is greater, into what remains steady through all things, into what does not rise and fall with time. And as the days continued, and the rhythm of the kingdom moved forward in its quiet and steady way, the truth remained unchanged and unshaken, that God is greater than everything, greater than every throne, greater than every kingdom, greater than all that is built and all that fades. And in that truth, there was rest, there was peace, there was a stillness that did not need to be forced. And so the story came to rest, not with an ending, but with a quiet continuation, as the night would come again, and the world would grow still once more, and the same steady truth would remain, just as it had from the beginning, and just as it will always remain, that God is greater than everything.